For the prise de débat, the honourable member for Timmins-James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As always, proud to rise and represent the people of Timmins-James Bay who put their trust in me, as indeed do all citizens of this country put their trust in all of us, regardless of whatever political party we represent. We are called to this place to rise above our own personal, our pecuniary, our familial interests to represent the people of this country. This is a work in progress, this institution, and it often does not live up to the standard that Canadians expect of it, but it is the democratic House of the people of Canada. I don't think that this is a debate that any of us engage in tonight with relish. I've worked with sorry, I won't use his name, he's still a city member, but the member for Peterborough for a number of years. We've had many memorable drop-down, drag-em-out scraps that were sometimes like Ali Fraser. I'm not saying that I was like Ali, but we did respect each other, and we worked well in committee. We worked well in the Heritage Committee on a number of issues. We worked sometimes less well in the Ethics Committee, which sometimes is more of a circus, but thank God the member for Sherbrooke was there to keep order. So we do develop relations across party lines, whether or not we agree with each other, and sometimes we have to call each other to task for not living up to the obligation that's upon all of us in this House. And tonight is one of those nights. The finding of guilt in a court of law for electoral fraud is a very, very serious issue, Mr. Speaker. It's a serious issue because it cuts to the heart of the democratic system of our country. The idea that people can game the system, that people can buy elections, cuts to the very credibility of whether or not we are a truly democratic institution. And we have to take these breaches of the law seriously. We cannot just write them off as mere mistakes. Unfortunately, we have seen in this last session of Parliament a number of incidents that have certainly raised the questions of the Canadian people about the ethical lapses that exist within the parliamentary system. We have had the suspensions without pay of Patrick Brazeau, Pamela Wall and Mike Duffy, all three of who are under investigation and going to trial. We have Mac Harb, the Liberal senator, who ran an extraordinary scheme to get money from taxpayers that, for an average Canadian, have to ask themselves, why would someone do that? Where Mac Harb, to get the housing allowance, bought a property 100 kilometers from Ottawa so he could collect $22,000 a year, and then he sold 99.99% of the property to somebody else. So he had a 0.01% claim, and then defrauded the taxpayers of $22,000 a year. Now, that kind of deviousness, the average Canadian would say, what kind of person would think like that? So this is a serious breach of public trust. And so we certainly expect that the RCMP will do full due diligence when we see the kind of fraud that's been committed in the Senate. We see Senator Raymond Levine, who was charged and convicted for fraud and breach of trust and sent to jail. Again, for schemes to use the money that is supposed to be there to serve the parliamentary process and the process of a senator, to use it for their own personal interests, is a breach of the trust of Canadians and cannot be set aside just because they're rich, just because they're powerful, just because they know people. Because as parliamentarians, we are put in this House to be the lawmakers of this land. And the fascinating thing about the parliamentary tradition means to be a lawmaker means that you are appointed by the people who put their trust in you. You may have no background in law. You may be a baker. You may be a cobbler. You could be an accountant. You could be a bass player in a punk band. If the people believe that you should be there reviewing the laws, then you are entrusted to review the laws. And that's a good process because it's saying that the review of law in this country is done and should be done by ordinary people who have ordinary life experiences, who are there to be reasonable, to look at legislation and ensure that legislation is done in the right manner. So when people breach the law knowingly, there has to be consequences, and this is what we're here to deal with tonight. Now, the issue before us is the case of breaching the Electoral Act, where the member for Peterborough spent $21,000 during his election campaign through Hollinshead to do voter outreach, but that would have breached the limit on the electoral spending limits of his campaign. So he and his official agent, Mr. McCarthy, only claimed $1,575 in services. Then issues were raised that these documents were falsified to Elections Canada to create a cover-up so that money was spent, services were hired, and yet they tried to claim that this was parliamentary and outside the work of the electoral season. So a number of issues of trust were breached at that moment. Number one, exceeding the limits. Number two, falsifying documents. And number three, trying to claim that work that was clearly within the purview of an election period was somehow parliamentary and should be claimed. Now, my colleague, the member for Peterborough, had been under investigation for some time on this. He did come into the House and plead his case as a matter of privilege. Unfortunately, his argument at the time, I think, was a false and misconstrued argument that his rights as a member of Parliament were somehow breached by the fact that he was under investigation for a crime. Certainly, I don't think that any Canadian would think that people under investigation for crime have a higher level of privilege to be protected just because they're a member of Parliament. But I say that again out of more of sadness than anything, because the charges against my colleague were very serious and the conviction is serious. And the Justice Lisa Cameron stated that in terms of finding him guilty on all charges, that there were numerous inconsistencies and obfuscations in terms of his testimony, that he simply wasn't a credible or believable witness. So she found him guilty, which then puts us in a very difficult position, because what happens in this House of Commons if the people who are supposed to make the laws actually break the laws of this country? And then my friend from Peterborough did himself more damage when he was asked about the judge's ruling, and he said that it was simply a matter of her opinion. To me, Mr. Speaker, that speaks of a larger disrespect for the law, that there's a sense that because he is a Conservative insider, that it's the judge's opinion that's at stake here, and that as opposed to reflecting on the breach of trust and the breach of faith with his citizens, with his the voters, with his own party in terms of what he's done, the need to take responsibility is a very puts more pressure on the House to act. We simply cannot carry on and pretend that nothing happened, or, well, now my colleague from Peterborough is saying he's got more evidence, he wants to reopen the case. The fact is he was found guilty. End of story. And having been found guilty, the House is forced to act. Now, it puts us in a situation, Mr. Speaker, where we haven't really dealt with this issue. It's with this issue of this manner within this House. We certainly know that in the Senate, where we have a number of senators under investigation, moves were made earlier this year to suspend without pay the three senators, Brazo, Wallen, and Duffy, without pay while they were under investigation. Matt Carb jumped ship at that point. But at that point, none of them had been charged, but it was felt because of the loss of faith in the Canadian people towards the Senate that they should be suspended without pay. So certainly in the case of a member of this House who's been found guilty, the issue of suspending him without pay is the first step. It's also a statement that this House takes breaches of the law seriously, that we as members, regardless of whatever party, say this is a serious breach. Now, what is the secondary step from this, Mr. Speaker? Well, the secondary step is that it should then go to the Procedure and House Committee to review the numerous pieces that are going to have to be figured out from this conviction and this suspension without pay. And this isn't to protect or to give my colleague from Peterborough any kind of extra privileges that an ordinary citizen wouldn't have, but because we are, as parliamentarians, entrusted to make sure we do due diligence in this. There are issues that do need to be addressed. For example, right now there are constituency staff who work for the member, who do work for Canadian people in Peterborough, who answer phones, who make sure that citizens are able to get that information, even if he's suspended, even if he cannot sit. We have to look at what that period is going to be. So the New Democratic Party has said that we have to send a clear message as a parliament that he needs to be suspended without pay. He cannot come in here, he cannot sit, he cannot vote. We have to send that message. How we move forward from there, I trust that all parliamentarians will put their partisan interests aside and make sure that this is done in a manner of due diligence. There's issues of, for example, his pension. Are we talking about retroactively stripping of someone of their pension? That's a serious question. I don't think that this is something that I want to stand up in the House and raise my fist on. I want due diligence done. I want it done right. I want this to be done in a manner that we say that passes the test of the Canadian people, that we did the right thing in this instant. It's unfortunate that the member for Peterborough has not chosen to resign and spare us all from having to deal with this, but we will deal with it. And I think we can deal with this in a manner that is respectful to the traditions of the House, and it's also a matter of respect to the voters of Peterborough. So we have to approach this, Mr. Speaker, with the larger sense that we are entrusted to do the right thing. As I said, Mr. Speaker, we have had a number of tawdry examples since in the last 4 years of breaches of the law that need to be addressed in terms of the lowering ethical standards of this House. We also had the unprecedented situation of Mr. Peter Panashaway, who was elected up in Labrador, a man who'd come with a very impressive reputation, who broke the electoral laws of this country and was forced to resign, lost his position and had to leave in disgrace. He wasn't here that long. Again, why are the electoral laws so important? Because in Canada we've established a principle: you shouldn't be able to buy an election. That the fairness of the Elections Act exists so that someone who wants to take on a long-standing incumbent, and that long-standing incumbent has built up their team, their volunteers, their money in the bank. The democratic processes in Canada says there has to be a limit on how much they can spend so that they aren't simply able to buy the kind of political exposure that another candidate couldn't buy. Now, this is something that's lacking in the United States, and I know many people in the United States look to our system and say, how is it that Canada has managed to maintain a more credible electoral system in some areas? And a lot of that has to do with the electoral financing laws. So people who game the system, who believe they can buy those votes, they have no business being in this House. So we had the resignation of Mr. Panashaway. We had in 2006 election the in-and-out scheme, where senior people in the Conservative Party had to cop a plea. Unfortunately, there was no punishment for them. In fact, they were elevated to the Senate, which I think sent a very bad message. We had the robo-fraud case in 2011 that was found in federal court, that there were numerous cases of robo-fraud taking place across the country, and the judge found that at the heart of it was the SIMS database, the phone database that was controlled by the Conservative Party. But because of the electoral laws, Elections Canada was not able to get the kind of information they required from witnesses, and so the case never went any further. So right now we have Michael Sona convicted, but we don't know who ran the false phone calls, for example, into Nipissing-Temiskaming, which was an election that was won by about 17 votes. Someone made those calls. Someone organized that database. We never got those answers, and that's a question that comes out on all of the credibility of this House, that if this kind of electoral fraud is able to happen and there are no consequences, then Canadians' faith in politics is going to suffer. So it puts us back to the issue before us tonight. I think we can do the right thing. We can do the reasonable thing. We do need to address, Mr. Speaker, the larger issues of accountability that have yet to be addressed from the abuses that we've seen in the Senate, and I'm hoping that when we see the Auditor General's report on the Senate spending, we will get a better sense of how to deal with that very belligerent institution. The problem on the other side is the refusal to put in some of the checks and balances that were put in on the House side. Now, this is not to say that there's angels sitting in the House of Commons, but there's some fundamental differences between the House of Commons and the Senate. Number one, people in the House of Commons have a democratic mandate. They were elected by the people. They can be fired by the people. Nobody can be fired on the Senate. You're there till you're 75, whether you show up to work or not, as our famous senator from Mexico who used to show up once a year just to show off his tan and collected money for years and years and years. There needs to be better issues of accountability on the other side. We know that when the Accountability Act was brought in 2006, it was one of the few times that we and the Democrats put our faith in the Conservatives that we could actually work together on improving accountability after the horrific abuses of the Liberal sponsorship years. But one of the things that interfered with our ability to bring better accountability was that the Senate refused to meet the same standards, which I think is very problematic. So what we're dealing with here...
Order the honourable member for Carleton, Mississippi Mills. On a point of order.
I believe the Speaker is relevant. I can't understand what he's talking about. He's not talking about the issue that's under consideration here. And I'd ask that he return to the issue.
The honourable member for Timmins-James Bay want to respond to the point of order?
Well, I'll speak slower, Mr. Speaker, but I'm talking about the issue of how we address crimes in the parliamentary precinct. That's what we're talking about. My colleague might find that uncomfortable, but this is the issue before us as we're dealing with the issue of crime. I've done this in a respectful manner. If he finds that offensive, well, I can't really do anything about that. But how do we deal with crime in the Senate? That we have 3 under investigation. The 4th is left, actually 4 under investigation. There may be more. We now have had 2 cases in the House of Commons. So I'm trying to compare how we do things in the House of Commons and what's incumbent upon us, Mr. Speaker, in light of the decision to make those suspensions in the Senate.
Well, we've had already from the previous member in the chair this evening a couple of questions indicating they were a long stretch from relevancy, and I think the member from Timmins-James Bay is falling into the same category. So I would ask him to bring it back more closely to the motion that's before the House, because I think he has wandered too far.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I can certainly focus on the criminal activities that have occurred in this House and what we should do. And this is before us tonight. So I said that in a light of nonpartisanship, I think that's nonpartisanship, that we have to suspend the member, and I think that that's a reasonable thing to do. In terms of Mr. Panashaway, who was up under this exact same situation, Mr. Speaker, he was forced to resign and had to leave in disgrace. So as I was saying earlier, why is it that we have to have really clear penalties for the breach of electoral fraud, of the Electoral Act and issues of electoral fraud? Well, it's because if Canadians can't trust that the system actually is there to ensure fairness in people running, then there can be no basis of electoral credibility or democratic credibility at any level. So when someone breaks the law and knowingly breaks the law and is defiant about breaking the law, it puts us in the House in a much more difficult position, Mr. Speaker, because we are forced to act. And this is what we're being forced to do tonight. The fact that the member for Peterborough stood in this House, claimed his privileges were being abused because he was under investigation, went to court, was found by the Justice, Cameron, to have absolutely no credibility in his claim, then to walk out of that courtroom and respond to a criminal conviction as somehow just the opinion of the judge puts us as legislators in a very difficult position, because he has no business being in this House if that's the attitude he has to take. So at no point did we ever see that he took the seriousness of the breaking of the law, the falsifying of documents, the continual refusal to respond to the investigators, and now he's been convicted. So yes, tonight we have to show that these issues have to be taken seriously in the same way we have to take the issues of Brazo, Wallen, Duffy, Macarb, Raymond Levine. We have to take this seriously. Thank you.
Oh, God.